This is easier for me on a lot of fronts because of these two gentlemen right here and my love for the game of baseball, but my love for the town too, having grown up here. And to celebrate America 250, we try to think of, what we can do that what might be a little bit different than other towns are offering. We had a great fireworks show. We had that a few weeks back. We did a kind of a history of the American Revolution, where I found an author who spoke to fifth graders who were studying about the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War at the time. And this is just another way as we celebrate America 250, and those would argue that football is our national pastime now. But for those who love the game of baseball, and to my right, talk about no introduction, and I could spend the entire time here talking about what these two have accomplished. But George Grande was made television history in September of 1979 when he co-anchored with Lee Leonard the first ever Sports Center, and what the history of ESPN has been from there. But he's so much more. George has been someone that people like myself who are starting out could look up to, could learn from, and I benefited from the time that we spent together at ESPN. George doesn't like me to give all his accolades, so I must spend a lot of time. George was also, when he was at ESPN, he'd won the Legendary Sportscaster of the Year multiple times. The gentleman to my left, Dom Amore, grew up, was it Boston Avenue or Mass Ave? Boston Avenue. Although he was just over the border into New Haven, I kind of claimed him as one of our own. And again, Dom was...
Taxes are higher in New Haven.
Dom is an 8-time Connecticut Sports Writer of the Year. He was on my Sunday night show many times. Don would join me too in 2009. Remember us reporting after Game 1 when Cliff Lee pitched the gem against the Yankees, and A.J. Burnett turned it around in Game 2. The one thing he did as a Yankee was good. But with respect to the history of the game and what it's meant through the years, first, George, from a historical standpoint, and what baseball has meant through the years, and Dom has a take on it as well from way back when. But I want to start with you, George, and kind of what comes to mind for you.
Well, first of all, Sarah, congratulations. And this is the first time I've been here in many years. I think the last time I was here, Frank Rosati had a get-together here, and it was upstairs, and it was remarkable, and this place is even more remarkable now. So please send congratulations to the whole staff. And he talked about September 7th of '79. The highlight of my career came way before that. That was when I did his hockey game when he was at East Haven, and I was doing the games on radio at WNHC, and we were at the Coliseum back in those days. We did three divisions, started at 10 in the morning, finished about 10 o'clock at night.
And it was penalty box, right?
That's right. And this is a true story. We did the first game that was ever broadcast at Edward L. Bennett Rink when West Haven played Hampton in hockey. How many of you guys are high school hockey fans? Follow it. Well, they had never had a game done there. So we set it up. Back in those days, you didn't have headset microphones. I had a microphone like this. So I put the microphone in my left hand. I took the two lineups of the two schools, Hampton and West Haven, and taped them with white athletic tape to the top of the boards, right? And I put them down, so I had Hampton here, West Haven here. How many of you remember Butchie Belmore? He was a great official, great athlete, and then he was a great official in the American Hockey League and did some NHL games too. Well, we start the game, and I'm in the penalty box, and the penalty box is the only part of the rink that doesn't have glass in front of it. They drop the puck, they go into the corner. Butchie Belmore the puck's coming around. Butchie Belmore pops up on top of the board to get away from the puck and the players, and the friggin' white tape sticks to his pants. And he takes off, and there go my 2 spotting charts. Down the ice, he picks it up like this, and he throws it into the stand. So I learned a lesson. We all learn early in our career. I learned a lesson, on what to do and what not to do. But it's been wonderful to be a part of athletics here in the state of Connecticut, and certainly in our area where, whether it's Thanksgiving morning football or high school basketball or high school football or whatever, it's special. And part of being special is baseball. I grew up loving the game of baseball. And by the way, before we start, I know most of you guys know him. I want to take a moment to pay homage to a guy we lost this weekend who was a tremendous advocate for the game of baseball and who loved the game of baseball, Rich Marazzi, who passed away this weekend. He wrote 8 books, 6 of them on baseball, 2 of them on Yale football. He ran, and some of you have been there, it was Silver Sluggers group in Derby. Over 50, 60 guys every month get together. He loved the game of baseball. He loved high school sports. He was a high school coach. He mentored so many young people, and he also believed in the game and what the game meant to our country, what the game meant to our young people. And I think that's what we all grew up with. Whether you're a Yankee fan or a Red Sox fan, and then later maybe a Mets fan. How many Mets fans here? That's your brother, huh?
I'm with
I
you.
thought he was a Yankee fan when he was a kid.
He was. I don't know what happened.
Good lifetime, Brenner.
Okay, how many Yankee fans? How many Red Sox fans? Oh, we got a good mixture. That's good. But whatever, we care about the game. And I think that's the one thing that Rich did. He kept people, and we had guys from 40 years of age to 90 years of age that went to his Silver Sluggers group. And he kept them involved because his game has changed so much. How could they stay involved? They maybe didn't use a computer. Maybe they don't know about analytics, but they did know about the history of the game. They knew about what it was that drew them to the game when they were kids. And I think that's what brought us all together. And for Rich, I think he was a great troubadour and a great advocate for the game. We're going to miss him a heck of a lot. I think we certainly pay homage to a guy who's a tremendous sportsman and a great advocate for the game of baseball. But for me, I grew up a Willie Mays fan. Whenever I played, I tried to wear number 24, whether it was football, basketball, baseball. And because I was a Mays fan, I guess I was a Giant fan for most of my life. And for me, just watching Joe DiMaggio, Duke Snider, Willie Mays glide across center field, do things that all of us could only dream of doing, meant something that was something very special. And we all had a dream. I mean, how many wanted to be Major League Baseball players? A lot of us, huh? And I did too. You did, Sarah? That's good. Today, maybe you could do it.
No talent.
Okay. I remember my goal was to play Major League Baseball. I went to college in California, to USC, and I learned pretty fast that there are a lot of people that are pretty good in high school, but when you get to play against the best, and the best go to big-time colleges now and play in the minor leagues, but you begin to realize maybe I won't be a Major League Baseball player, but how can I keep my love for the game alive? And I think that's what we've all done. Somehow we've done it through our lives. We've taken a game that we played as kids. We've taken a game that we learned how to play. We learned the intricacies of the game. We sat with our dad and kept score. We listened on the radio and kept score. And how do you keep that? Other sports have, they've got, people say, like you were saying, Rich, maybe football is by some the national pastime, but there's something different about baseball. There's something that draws people together. It's an individual sport, yes, but it's a team sport as well. There's no sport that allows us to use our brains, our mind, to think ahead more than the game of baseball. And I think what we've been able to do is keep that love and that love affair. And I think all of us, I know Dom and I talk about it very often, we've been able to keep a love affair with the game going. And hopefully we can talk about that, and you guys can tell us about how you feel about it today too.
Well, as usual, George being a little 200-mile radius. I think that's fair to say, right? Maybe the hockey story reminded me of a story that I'm sure you've heard a million times. Maybe it's urban legend, but Yogi Berra was asked to speak at a high school banquet and congratulate their 3 fall, winter, spring athletes of the year. And he was afraid he was going to forget the names. So he made cheat sheets for himself and he pinned the coach's name on this wrist and the athletic director's name here, and he put the 3 names of the athletes in his pocket, right? And when he got up there, he said, well, I'd like to thank your athletic director, Phil Johnson, and I'd like to thank Coach Ron Smith, and I especially want to congratulate your 3 fine athletes, Art Schaffner and Marks. No, as I was mentioning, and by the way, before we get to it, probably my favorite story I've done in 44 years was I got a private tour of the Yogi Museum with Yogi. That was quite an experience. I'll talk about it later. But and those would actually be true. But the historians sort of agree. It's kind of a consensus of American historians that baseball began its love affair with America and vice versa during the Industrial Revolution, years after the Civil War. Prior to that, America was a predominantly agricultural nation. Far more people lived on farms than lived in cities. And after the Civil War, the country became far more industrialized. More and more people lived in the cities, factories, smokestacks, steam engines blowing black smoke. And it was a kind of a bleak existence. And what baseball did, as it became popular, was it offered a throwback to the agricultural America that a lot of people missed. It offered a pastoral setting of a great expanse of grass within, brick walls and in a city setting. If you go walk by the old Comiskey Park or Fenway Park today, it would look from the outside like just another factory in the block. You'd have to go inside and see how green the grass was. You know how people always say when you go to the ballpark, how green the grass was. So that it was kind of an appeal, and it was a perfect pastime for the day because it was slow and it was leisurely, and you could kind of catch your breath and watch the game unfold pitch by pitch, inning by inning. People weren't in a hurry for the game to be over in 1880 like they are today. So obviously after the 20th century began, fewer and fewer people were around who remembered that agriculture in America, but now the game was rooted in American culture. And gradually other sports that maybe could be played indoors or on the gridiron also took their place and became popular. But I would say probably until well into the 1950s, if you were a sports writer, you either wanted to cover baseball or boxing. Those were the 2 glamour jobs. It was only in the late 1950s that the other sports took hold. But, for me, Babe Ruth said it best. The only real sport, I believe, is baseball. You have to grow up with it, start at the bottom as a little kid, and let it grow up with you. And that's the way it was for me. I did not aspire to be a player. I knew my limitations at an early age. But, to me, it's been 19 years since the Courant took me off the Yankees beat full time. And, I would go back tomorrow, even at this age, if I could. Nothing against UConn. I love covering UConn. Love Gino, love Dan Hurley. But if I could go back and do baseball another couple of years, I'd do it in a minute.
You mentioned Yogi, and it brings me back to there's an agency in New Haven that's still there called Clifford Beers. And one year I get a call. George is the MC. The guest is Yogi. Yogi did not do speeches. he wouldn't appear before you, wouldn't give a speech. So Noah Fins and I sat at a table with Yogi and introduced them, and we all had dinner together. Yogi's wife, who was a lovely lady as well, Carmen. And the second Yogi thing I think of is, I was down in North Carolina one year, and there was the award that I mentioned that both these gentlemen have won, the organization, National Sportscaster Sports Writers Association.
And you've won it from Clemens.
And so I met Joe Garagiola, and we were talking about Yogi, and he says, I got to tell you this one. He says, I get a call from Carmen. She says, Joe, you're not going to believe this. What did he say now? She said, I said to him, listen, you're not getting any younger. Your entire adult life, you've pretty much spent in New York, New Jersey. You're from the hills, the hill section in St. Louis. When the time comes, where do you want to be buried? He thinks about it and says to her, surprising. You really can't make it up. And with George, one thing, I worked with George for years. George has talked about everybody, has reported on everyone, never talked about himself. So I knew him for a long time, before I ever knew that he played at USC, played with Kingman, with Bill Lee, right, among others. So when he tries to tell you, Tom Seaver, and Tom Seaver, I'm burying the lead. So yeah, I mean, and then to have him and Joe Castiglione both grow up in Hamden and both become Major League play-by-play announcers is pretty special. One thing that you taught me was you can have a working relationship with the athletes. And you can't be buddy-buddy because you can't be objective. But there is a way to do it and do it right. And that's one of the many things that I learned from you.
I'll answer that, but let me just tell you Yogi Berra's story first. And this is true. How many got his book, with all his quotes, and it's great. And there's so many stories, Dom's story, his story. I'm with the Cardinals, and Bucky Dent is our third base coach, and we're in spring training. We're training in St. Petersburg, and the Yankees are in Tampa. And at that point, Joe Torre was managing, and Yogi was back as a coach, as a bench coach. And we're getting ready to go over to play them at Tampa, and Bucky says, he comes in, he's so elated, he's handing out cigars, he goes, guess what? Mary Ann, his wife, is pregnant, and she's going to have twins. He said, I can't wait, we're going there tomorrow, I'm going to tell Yogi. And he's going to be so excited. So we get there, we get off the bus, we go walking in, and Yogi was always at the in the dugout before anybody else, sitting there with his bat and talking with people. So we go over and Bucky, of course, played, in New York as a shortstop for the Yankees and knew Yogi from when he was a kid. And he was like his son. He goes, yo, guess what? Mary Ann, and Yogi loved Mary Ann. He said, guess what? Mary Ann's pregnant. Oh, that's good. He said, and she's going to have twins. She's going to have twins. Yeah, we're going to have twins, and we're going to have two kids. She goes, yeah, she could have both at the same time. That's Yogi. The things he said, he really said. It wasn't like he made this stuff up. And there were so many and one other story. This is a true story. One of the blessings I had, and I emceed the Hall of Fame ceremonies for 30 years, and we would have the big banquet on Saturday night and on Friday night an informal dinner. And every single year, I would go up there, Yogi and his wife Carmen, Phil Rizzuto and his wife Cora, and Whitey Ford and his wife Joan. The three couples would sit together. They lived 5 miles apart in northern Jersey, and they would have dinner once a week. So they would all sit there together, and I would always sit with them. And it was like watching your aunt and uncles sit there at a 4th of July picnic, the way they banter back and forth. So one time I'm sitting there and Carmen says to me, tell Yogi to tell you the story about the Mexican League. Yo, tell me the story about the Mexican League. Oh, no, I can't tell that story. So Whitey says, let me tell it. And this is a true story. Back in the early 1950s, the Mexican League started and they were trying to rob players from Major League Baseball. And they threw, back then, the players are making, $5,000, $6,000. They're offering $50,000 and 100 acres of land where you could build a house and do whatever you want to do. So Carmen and Cora and Joan are all close friends. And Carmen is listening to Yogi talking to Whitey on the phone. She's in the other room. And Whitey is saying to Yogi, we got an offer of $50,000 each to go to Mexico, play in the Mexican League. And, so this is a great deal. Whitey was the guy who really was smart, money-wise, and he was. So they figure it out, and now Carmen's listening. He said, and Yogi said, well, I don't know, what do you think? And he said, well, we're gonna, who's gonna tell the wives? And they're going back and forth. So now Carmen he says, $50,000, that's a lot of money. So unbeknownst to the men, the women know what's going on. Now, they go to dinner, and Whitey's the spokesman for the three. And he explains, girls, we've got a tremendous offer. And the girls have already talked about this, and they put the kibosh on it. So we've got a tremendous offer, $50,000 each, and we each get land to build whatever we want, free transportation, don't have to pay a thing. And we're thinking of taking this deal. What do you girls think? And Carmen's speaking for the women now. She goes, Whitey, Scooter, Yogi, we wish you men the best of luck. Because if you three are stupid enough to take this, you're going by yourself, and you're not going with us. And so they ended up, they killed the deal. Now, for those of you that might not know, what happened was players who did jump to the Mexican League were banned from baseball forever. They did get some money. Guys were getting $10,000, $5,000, $20,000. Nobody got 50 like the Yankees were going to get. So it was the three women that saved them from being banned from baseball.
Yeah, Sal Magley jumped.
Yeah.
And the commissioner did order the Giants to take him back. And it was only because he became the best pitcher in the game.
Yeah. A lot of other people who were banned.
They never got better.
And to answer Rich's question, he started by saying the game has changed. We love the game. The game has changed in a lot of ways. Dom and I were blessed to cover the game. You mentioned Joe Castiglione, and Joe and I talked the other day, and we were marveling and reminiscing about our careers. We started in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s when teams were run by general managers. They would put a team together, and then they turned the team over to their manager, who'd run the team, had free reign over the team during the course of the year. General manager didn't make many trades, didn't get in their way, they just ran the team the way they wanted to run it. Then we got into the 70s and 80s when things changed with free agency and the drugs that came as well. And now we're into the analytic era. So there are three different eras that we were all part of. Dom was part of that too. And I think the one thing that we were blessed with when we started in the business was we could go into a clubhouse. You'd sit down, and I was mentored by Dick Young, Milt Richmond, Will Grimsley, Dave Anderson, people like that who were great writers. And Dick Young taught me one thing. He said, you got to get something nobody else has. You got to go into the clubhouse and ask questions of the players. Dick Young was the first writer to actually go into the clubhouse and get
stories that he would use. Everybody else just sat up in the press box. And we would make relationships with players. And there's a delicate balance, as Rich said, where you want to build a friendship and a professional relationship, but you also have to be standoffish to a little bit. But they got to know you, you got to know them. And to this day, some of my best friends in life are former players or managers or coaches because you were able to build that relationship. Today, it's a different story. They keep you out of the clubhouse, they keep you out of the locker room.
So it's a lot different, isn't it, Don?
Yeah, well, a lot of that is a change in our industry, more so than baseball. With the advent of the internet and social media, teams today have their own platforms to tell their own stories the way they want to tell them. It's basically one gigantic house organ, so to speak, and so they don't want us in there, and we don't really. So we were the clubhouse doors would open 3.5 hours before, and you had and there was in the Yankee Stadium, the old one. There was no place for players to hide. They had to be. Now they built all these different rooms in back. So you get in there and you might get a 2-minute window to try to get Aaron Judge to stop talking. So no, it's not like it was when I would walk in and just sit down and talk to Derek Jeter for 15, 20 minutes, or Andy Pettit or guys like that, even Roger Clemens. It was much, much different because they depended on the conventional media to tell their story. Now they tell their own stories, and that's in every aspect of sports and news that news organizations cover. The WNBA. I mean, they have the worst access, and they're probably the least media-friendly league there is, and they need media more than anybody because they want to tell their own stories their own way. So that's kind of changed. And that's obviously, covering baseball is not as much fun as it used to be.
And just so you guys know, the reason this microphone is here, at some point, if you have questions, certainly for George or Dom or even myself, we'd be happy to take them.
But he won't allow any Mets fans to ask questions.
He doesn't let me forget that.
And don't let me talk about Bruins.
Well, you've got the best theme song. No one's ever touched it.
That's great. So, to your point too, there was a player for the Hartford Whalers named Jim McKenzie, who was a tough guy. And one thing I would do was, even if I didn't have a photographer to go with me, I would sometimes go to Whalers practice, see what they're doing, especially the day before a home game. Are they doing anything with their lines or whatever? And just to be there, just to be seen, and they know that, you care and you're there. So there was a trade rumor that was pretty hot, and I ran into or sought out McKenzie in the locker room. I don't know what's happening to her mic. And Sarah to the rescue. Thank you. So I said, Jim, listen, I heard a rumor. If I'm right, just walk away. He said, what'd you hear? And I said, so-and-so for so-and-so. Rich, good to see you. Shook my hand and walked away. Told me without telling me. And Don tells a great story about Joe Torre on when you do as a writer, how Torre would answer a trade rumor. If the answer was probably yes, it was one way. If it was no, probably another way.
It was very simple. If it was yes, he would say, I have heard that name. And then you knew it was good.
And if it wasn't, what would he say?
I have not heard that name. and then you knew enough and then you knew you were barking up the wrong tree.
This is a true Joe Torre story. When I was with the Cardinals, the last game of the season, we're playing the Mets, and the crew chief, Doug Harvey, was retiring from the game of baseball. He eventually got into the Hall of Fame, umpired for 20 some odd years, and before the game, the umpires are huddling with the managers, and Joe is sitting talking, and I'm watching, and this is on Friday night. You got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and the season's over. So on Friday night, all of a sudden, Joe and Doug Harvey are continuing a conversation, and game's over. I would always go into the manager's office afterwards, ask the questions, whatever, and then when it's all over, you go in just to sit down and have a beer or just talk. And I said, Joe, by the way, what were you and Doug Harvey talking about after you exchanged lineup cards? And he smiled, and he said, close the door. I said, Doug Harvey says to me, he says, Joe, you know this is my last series umpiring in Major League Baseball. Yeah, I know that, Doug. And Doug was, he was the old professor. He called players kids, son, whatever, he was Mr. Perfection. He never made a mistake. That's what he believed anyway. So he said, I've had a great career. Do you know who the first person I ever ejected from a game was? And Joe said, no, I don't know. He said, it was you. He said, do you know who the last person I'm going to eject from the game is going to be? You. So now it's Friday night. This is 1992, right? And we go through Friday, we go through Saturday, and then on Sunday, the visiting dugout at Shea Stadium was on the third base side. Doug Harvey had he had home plate for the first game, not the last game. So he's at first base. And there's a big argument. And back and forth, there's players going here and there, and Joe Torre comes out, and he's just standing there, and all of a sudden, Doug Harvey runs up to Joe Torre in front of the dugout, and he goes like this, and Joe Torre is smiling, and he goes like this, you're out of here. Now, the guy I'm doing the game with is saying, I don't understand that Joe Torre didn't say a thing, and he's been ejected from the game. So now the game is over. And I go into Joe's office, and Joe, we close the door again. I said, so are you going to tell the story? He said, no, I'm not going to tell it. I don't know when I'm going to tell it. 1992. Finally, Doug Harvey gets into the Hall of Fame. And at this point, this is like 10, 12 years later. I'm in Los Angeles. Joe Torre is managing the Dodgers. And it's Friday night, and I'm leaving the next day to go to Cooperstown to do the Hall of Fame ceremony. And I said, Joe, and he knows Doug Harvey's going in the Hall of Fame. I said, are you going to tell the Doug Harvey story? He says, I'm going to tell it tomorrow. So you can tell it tomorrow, and then I can tell it at Cooperstown. So it took that long, and you talk about stories that you get. You never know when you're going to use it. You sit on it, and the right time comes. So it took years and years, and we finally got to use the Doug Harvey story. And when I told the story, we did the day after Cooperstown, we had a roundtable discussion. I told the story, and Doug started to laugh. How did you find out about that?
Well, I have a couple of them. One of them, guy that I know both you guys know, Bill Dowling, was the general counsel for the Yankees. Later on, he owned the New York Rockets for many, many years. And I'd always try to unlock him and get his best George Steinbrenner stories from the 80s. And he would always either not tell me or tell me that I couldn't use them. So when George passed away and I was writing the obit, I called him up and I said, you got to give me, he's gone now, you got to give me your best George story. One that's, that's not going to be, obviously, harmful, one that's going to be occasional. And so he said, he called me into the office one day and he said, Dowling, who's this character, this Springfield, Springsteen? Who's this guy going around calling himself the boss? I'm the boss. I'm the one who's not him. I want you to trademark that so he can't use it. So, Bill said, George, you can't trademark the boss. It's not a neat phrase. I mean, anyone who's an employer is called the boss. boss. He goes, well, damn it, if you're not going to do it, you're fired. I'll get somebody in there. But, of course, he wasn't fired. He came back the next day. George flew over. George forgot about it. But he said, Bill would say, from that day forward, I was on my toes anytime somebody was using the Yankee name or the Yankee logo or the Yankee brand or somebody's name. I was on my toes to make sure that they weren't infringing on our intellectual property. And there was a method to George's madness. By demanding what was impossible, he got everyone's best effort. Everybody was on his creative tension. He got everyone's, best effort. So that was kind of my story that couldn't be told for a good 10 to 12 years, right?
George Steinbrenner fired so many people so many times. I mean, you know about the Billy Martin, you're fired, he's back, you're fired, he's back. Harvey Green was the PR director for the Yankees, and his roommate was Dennis D'Agostino, who was the PR director for the New York Knickerbockers. And George would fly from Tampa to New York, and Harvey's job was to pick him up at the airport when he got in. Well, this one time he ends up, the plane's delayed, there's thunderstorms or whatever. This is before cell phones. So he calls Harvey's home, and Dennis picks up the phone. And he says, Harvey. He said, no, Harvey's not here. Oh, where is he? He said, I don't know. He said, well, you better get him because I'm going to be at the airport and I want to make sure he's there. He said, well, I can't get to him. He said, well, you better tell him that he's going to be fired if he doesn't get there. He said, well, I'm not going to get to him. He said, you better do that because if I don't, I'm going to fire him and then I'll fire you too. He said, I don't work for you. I'll get you fired anyways.
I think it's always fun to talk with people to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit. Some of the things that we've seen in the old stadium, and these gentlemen certainly walked it many times, the media entrance was the same as the player entrance. So the first time I ever did it was I was doing updates for KC 101, Yankees Royals 1980 playoffs. So you'd go in, take a hard right, go down the stairs, and at the bottom, visiting clubhouse to the left, Yankees to the right. You'd follow that around, and then eventually you'd get to the clubhouse door, and then the tunnel where you saw the DiMaggio quote would hang and stuff. Walk down that tunnel to the dugout, and I mean, talk about goosebumps, right? But if you kept going beyond the clubhouse, which you weren't supposed to do, there was the umpire's room. And I don't know what came over me. I was covering a playoff game, and Eddie Rabuano from East Haven had the plate that night, actually. And I wandered down in the room, and there's an attendant sitting outside there. I asked him for Eddie. He said, who are you? I told him. Sure enough, Eddie came out, and it's maybe a half hour before the game, and cool as can be. And but he looks at me and goes, who'd have thunk it? Two guys from East Haven. And we're here. But he once told me he went at it one time with Jim Leland, when Leland was managing the Pirates. And he said, I mean, this was bad. It was just one of those ones you see that went on and on, like an Earl Weaver type of argument. Next day, he flies to the next city, gets to his hotel, phone rings, Eddie, Jim Leland. And Leland called to apologize. So there is an element to the game that there's so much pressure and everything else on these guys, but the bottom of it, they're just normal people like you and I that happen to have a specific talent. But it was cool to hear that, because when you thought of Leland, you thought of this cranky, curmudgeon in some ways, but he had a big heart.
Yeah, Leland, in fact, I talked to him not too long ago for a story that I did on Mark Fidrich for Baseball Digest. But Leland, that's another thing that's changed with baseball, was that the pregame bull sessions with managers was in the office.
Yeah.
Everybody would walk in, sit in the office, and talk, and the manager would have his feet up and probably be smoking a cigarette. Or later he might do it like Joe Locatore, like to do it in the dugout. Now it's like a structured thing. It's got to be a press conference in front of a backdrop so that the team can film it and put it on social media. and everything's very give and take and structured. And if you're, the way you learn to do the job, as Dick Young taught you, the press conference is the least of what we do our business. We want to do our business, away from that. I don't want to, no offense, but I don't want to do the TV people's work for them by asking all my good questions in a press conference. So, but yeah, and when Leland was managing, and I had privy to a few of those, he'd be in his office and it would be outrageous. You had to know what he meant for publication and what he didn't, and the colorful language and all of that. Gino's like that, by the way. You got to know, what he's actually intends to be on the record. But no, and Leland was one of the last of those old school managers where you could just sit in his dugout and just chew the bull like you were in Smitty's across the street.
Rich mentioned Eddie Rapuano, and for those of you that don't remember, there's a great history and tradition of umpiring in the state of Connecticut. Terry Tate is retired. He lives in Cheshire right now. Was one of the best. And Eddie was probably the best umpire in either the American or National League when he was umpiring. And Steve Palermo was another one who was the best in his era. Unfortunately, he had to retire after he tried to protect a woman at a restaurant in Texas who got shot in the back and was paralyzed. Mark and John Hirschbeck were from the Valley, Greg Kosk. So there were so many great umpires from the state of Connecticut that did a great job for many, many years.
Yeah, and in fact, one of my favorite stories that I did during the pandemic, but back in the 80s or maybe late 70s, whatever it was, Andy Baylock was the longtime UConn baseball coach. He couldn't get umpires for his fall scrimmages. So he got permission from the school to offer a 1-credit course at night to teach umpire, so that he could then get a few people who knew what they were doing and they could umpire the scrimmages. And 3 major league umpires came out of that course, two crew chiefs, Mark Reynolds and Dan Iasonia. Both came out of that course that Andy Baylock taught at UConn. So yeah, you don't think of Connecticut, but really you should. We're the land of steady habits, and umpires should come from Connecticut, right? They're right down the middle.
One other note in terms of umpiring, and Rich Marazzi. And Rich, for many years, he was a high school umpire while he was coaching sports at O'Brien Tech and in Ansonia. But he did regular umpiring, and then because of his link to the Yankees, he got to do the Old Timers game. He was the umpire at the Old Timers game. And we were down there, this was probably 81 or 82. He did it for many, many years. And at the old stadium, and even at the new stadium, it's changed a little bit, but at the old stadium, there was an auxiliary locker room right past the umpire's room. And that's where the old timers were dressed, because the Yankee locker room was not anywhere near as big as the one they have now. And I went down there, I'm in the Yankee clubhouse, and I go down to the old timers area, and all of a sudden, I see Rich, and he's putting on his umpiring garb, and he looks like he's going to faint. And I go, Rich, what's the matter? He goes, he can't talk. I said, what's the matter? He said, I just went in and he spoke with a bit of a stutter at times. I went in the Yankee locker room, and Joe DiMaggio was there. And he talked to me. So it was a moment that, he was like frozen in time, that he got to meet Joe DiMaggio, and he said, Joe, how you doing? And Joe, nobody else was in the locker room at the time. It was just Joe and him. Everybody else had left. Joe was waiting. Everybody else had gone out. And we talked about that so often later in years, that was one of the moments of his career that he'll never forget. He got to meet Joe DiMaggio, just the two of them, in a locker room together, which is pretty neat.
And the thing that stood out to me about Rich is he's such a rules expert, to the extent that teams, I know the Yankees were one, would hire him to come to spring training and go over rules, especially those that are not, commonly known. But he was a stickler for stuff like that. When you think about specific interviews, we've all had them, and Dom, you alluded to the fact that, the press conference, you're trying to get guys alone, one-on-ones if you can. One of the all-time ones, well, two real quick for me, was the day they set the August 12th strike date in '94. Yankees and Red Sox played an afternoon game at the stadium. The night before, the game was suspended, right? They play that, Yankees won in extra innings. Play the regularly scheduled game, Tom Bernansky solo homer, Sox win 1-0. But you go in the locker room, it's going to be all about the strike date being set for August. So I go to the Yankees first, couldn't get into manager's office. So go in the main locker room, and Paul Gibson was the Yankees player up, I think, got him. And I said, before I go to the Red Sox locker room, Paul O'Neill was having a great year. In fact, he ended up winning the batting title when the lockout occurred. But he's just sitting there, and I said, hey, Paul, can we talk to you? I didn't play today. Felt like saying, yeah, I was at the game. So I said, well, I said, Lord, I said something about having a great year or whatever. I said, more specifically, yourself, you had a great first year as a Yankee last year, off to a great start. Gets up. I don't want to effing talk about it. I'm sick of effing talking about it. And I'm standing there like this. I look at the guy next to me. He goes, pissed him off. And I said, oh well.
That's what I call a walk-off.
The second one was I go to Yankees Red Sox afternoon game at the stadium, and I'm going to do a feature on Kevin Youkilis. May have been his rookie year. Moved from third to first. Coco Crisp got hurt. They moved him into the leadoff spot. Wasn't a prototypical leadoff guy, but he had a good year. And Andy Phillips had played in Norwich, gets called up to the Yankees, the one nondescript name in their lineup. So, did the visitors hit first batting practice? Or second?
Last.
Yeah, last. Okay, so do the Yankees batting practice, get shots of Andy, have my photographer shoot him taking ground balls in the cage. Same thing with Youkilis. Team's walking off, I'm going to stand in front of the dugout, introduce myself to Kevin, and ask for a couple of minutes. I'm maybe from here to the mic stand, right? And I'm going, Kevin. Doesn't even acknowledge me calling his name. And I'm thinking, I shouldn't say this, but Kevin, you're uglier than sin. You ought to be extra nice. So now, all right, I look around. Now the gates aren't open yet, so there's just a handful of people there, mostly workers in the stands. But I notice Ortiz by the screen talking to a woman and a couple of kids. So I look, there's not a writer walking his way. So I make a beeline for him, introduce myself. I said, yeah, I used to cover you in New Britain. He goes, yeah, man, I got to do a radio. Come in the dugout. So I'm sitting in the dugout between Francona's here, Ortiz is here, talking to the guy over there in Spanish. When he's done, turns to me, ask him 4 or 5 questions, thank him, shake his hand. I look at Terry, and I still think maybe I'll get Youkilis after the game. So I ask Terry, can I ask you a question? He says yes. Ask him about Youkilis. He answers it. I then introduce myself and thank him. And that was it. But so I got blown off by Youkilis, and then I end up one-on-one with as big a star as there is in the game. And it couldn't have been any nicer, couldn't have been any better. I did not like Ortiz.
I had one time I drove all the way to Yankee Stadium to get David Ortiz for 90 seconds. But it worked. Yeah, it was about a guy that he tutored who was with, I think, with the Rockettes. But that's all I need. It was enough. That was good. I'll tell you a few things. Paul O'Neill, when he got irritated, his voice would go up like a trio. And he would wave his arms like this. So we used to call him the pterodactyl. And my favorite pterodactyl moment was he got a game-winning hit on getaway day in Toronto in the 17th inning. And we all were waiting for him, and finally he shows up, we all flock over to him, and he goes, what do you want? It's 1:45. I got a hit. We won the game. Get lost. And he walked out. So it made my story. But that auxiliary locker room, one old-timers day after Matsui had joined the Yankees. Can't tell you my Matsui stories in mixed audience here, but we were down, all the Japanese reporters were down by the auxiliary clubhouse because they wanted to ask all the old-timers about Matsui. And all of a sudden, down the hall stops the great Yankee in the 50s, Hank Bauer, who was a Marine on Okinawa. And he walks down the hall, he sees the Japanese reporters, he stops, and he starts screaming at them in Japanese for like 4 or 5 minutes. Then he goes, yeah, you guys didn't think I knew all that shit, did you? And Japanese reporters all turned to me and goes, how does he know how to speak Japanese? You don't want to know.
Part of what they're talking about is it's a rite of passage. If you're a television, radio, newspaper reporter, you're tested, and you have to pass it. It's almost like hazing. They have to see what kind of a guy you are. And once you pass that test, you got a friend for life. You got somebody that knows he can trust you, or if you do something that irritates them, you got an enemy for life. But I think we all ended up doing that in different ways. I'll never forget, and part of the beauty of being here in Connecticut, we had the Red Sox in New Britain, you had the Yankees in West Haven, the Dodgers were in Waterbury. You get to see a lot of the players as they came through the minor leagues. I did rookie development with Major League Baseball for 24 years, where they'd send all their minor leaguers to Lansdowne Convention Center, and you get to know the guys before they made it to the major league, so you built a relationship with them. And when Jim Rice first came up, Rice didn't interview with anybody. And I went up to him one day, and I'm in covering the Red Sox at Fenway for a couple of days. So I said, Jim, can we do an interview? He said, yeah, right after batting practice, 4:15. 4:15 comes, and I'm all set, and he runs right by me into the clubhouse. So I said, Jim, and he just went right by me. So I was very close with Johnny Pesky, who was a coach with the Red Sox for many years, and just a wonderful person. And Johnny's standing right by me. And so I'm thinking, what the heck, no big deal. There was 87 other people you can interview, although I wanted to interview Jim Rice. So we go Friday night, we're finished. Saturday, and I said, Jim, we're going to do that interview? He says, yeah. And now it's a day game the next day. He says, 10:15, right over here. So 10:15 comes, I'm all set here, ready to go. He's just right by me again. Now, I'm still standing there, I go, whatever. And now all of a sudden, I'm getting ready, I'm looking for somebody else to interview. All of a sudden, I get this tap on my shoulder. And he says, you ready to do that interview? I said, yeah. We do the interview, and he's got a smile on his face. He's looking over his shoulder, and it began a relationship that we had that lasted all the way through him getting into the Hall of Fame. He was a different kind of guy. But when it happened, Johnny Pesky saw what happened. And Johnny Pesky went up to him, as I found out later, said, look, that guy's a good guy. You go over there and interview with him, or I'm going to kick your butt. And this is Johnny Pesky looking up at Johnny Pesky could say that to somebody. So we all passed that test. We all had to do that. And some did, some didn't. But it's kind of a rite of passage. And today, in this day and age, you hear a lot about hazing. You hear a lot about this or that. But there's something about being tested. And I think we all went through it, whether it was football, basketball, baseball, and in the pros especially.
I think, and I'm going to let any of you ask more of the questions that pertain to today's game, I think, as we talk about some of the things from the past. But there was one time I produced for you in Boston. Bowie Kuhn resigned, right? and George was in Rhode Island, I think, and, ESPN called, you were on vacation. And they told me, go to Boston, give me a photographer. We drove to Boston, and we set something up, lights, the whole bit. George is sitting down with Bowie Kuhn, and I'm standing off to the side, and the photographer at the time was a separate record deck. So the cameras today, it's all in one, but this was a record deck that I would carry on my shoulder and ride the audio during the interview. So I'm off to the side, and somehow somebody walked in sort of on it, and I look, just as they hit the cord, and the light, I could see, like it's like in slow motion, and I know it, and it's like I did it too, right? And I'm like, oh. Sure enough, and both of them snapped their heads back looking at me, and I'm like, I don't know, somebody had walked by, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
But I tell you, in those eras, Rich and I go back to when he played in high school in East Haven, but in the time at ESPN, we had a 7 o'clock sports center, an 11 o'clock sports center, then a 2 a.m. sports center. And Rich was, he was not doing any on-air work. He was doing production work. We'd go on the road. He'd carry the camera, did different things, then became a associate producer. But he knew what he wanted to do. So we get finished with the 2 a.m. sports center, and then they'd take the script. And we'd sit there until 4:30 in the morning. He'd practice the sports center that we just did. The camera guys would stay. That's what we all cared about each other, and we had, like Tom Green was doing the same thing. Different guys who wanted to be on the air, but didn't have a chance to be on the air. So till 4:30 in the morning, then you go home after that. But that's the kind of work you had to put in to get the great career that he had.
And then you'd play in the softball league in the morning there. But so we would buy the engineers, case of beer for doing it. But this is why, I've said it a million times, that people like George, and I'm sure Dom is this with young writers who come to him for his advice. When you've been fortunate enough, and I certainly was beginning at KC 101 and some of the people that I worked with there, and then with ESPN and George and the late Tom Mees, who I was also very close with. When you're around those people, not only I think do you learn the intricacies to that profession, but how to treat people. And one of the promises that I made to myself was, if you ever get in a position where people are now going to come to me seeking advice on how to do it, well, think of George Grande and Tom Mees and Jerry Christopher and Danny Lyons and all those people through those really kind of formative years, and you have to pay it forward. So you owe it to them, and I was happy to do it because that's what people did for me. So the learning wasn't just about what to ask, what not to ask, how to ask it, all those things, but it really had to do with treating people. And when you hear just people talk about these two gentlemen, it's not just about their ability to write or broadcast. It's a lot more than that, and that's what has always impressed me.
Well, I remember Derek Jeter's last game. Buck Showalter was there managing Baltimore. Of course, Showalter had managed Jeter at the beginning. And I thought he had one of the best, most insightful comments ever about Jeter and about leadership. That he understands the power of his words. He understands the impact of what he says. And that would also extend to his gestures and his body language. If Soriano or Cano booted a ball and just missed the ball, you'd look at Jeter and he would be like, happens, don't worry about it. But if they made a mental error that they had no business making, then you'd look at Jeter and it would be, and he understood instinctively the power of that. And that really carries into every walk of life, including ours. A young sportscaster who sits down with Joe Castiglione or George Grande or the late great John Sterling or anyone like that, the things that he says to them matter. And so when I go now at age 64 and I go to a UConn, availability or a game or whatever, I know that if I act like, hey, I'm sick and tired of this, what am I still doing this for, why am I here? The young people, especially the ones I've worked with, are going to pick up on it. And they're going to like, boy, is this what it's going to be like 40 years from now if I stay in this business? So, I try to, make sure that I, dress like I take it seriously and act in a way that show that I'm still as enthusiastic as ever for the job, which I am. And you'd be surprised. Young people act like they're too cool for school and they're not really paying attention to you, but they're paying attention. And they pick up on everything. Someone just left the paper recently and said, I learned so much just by watching. And I had always thought this person wasn't even that impressive. But they do indeed pay attention. So the power of your words and gestures is what leadership is.
And, we all, in each of our professions, I think you all see it, and we talk about it in the game of baseball too. I was just with Dusty Baker a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the state of the game today. And he lives in San Francisco now, and the Giants are struggling. He's an advisor with the Giants. He was our manager in Cincinnati. He was a manager in Houston, of course, where he finally won his World Series. And I call him Johnny B. It's Johnny B. Baker, Jr. That was his dad's name too. I said, Johnny B., I said, how many leaders are there in the game today? And he goes, ooh. And as Don was alluding to, there aren't people on teams, in many cases, who will get in somebody's face if they make a mistake. Not a physical error, but a mental error, or they do something that is not, Jazz Chisholm, some of the things that he does. Nobody's going to step in his face. Nobody's going to step in front of him and say, we don't do that here. That's another error. Another Joe Torre story, when I was with the Cardinals, we went through spring training. Joe had left Atlanta, then became a broadcaster, and after he left St. Louis, got fired in St. Louis. But he had a great vision of the game in many ways. And we spent the whole spring training together. And the night before the season started, we went out to dinner. And I said, okay, let's talk about the 25-man roster. He had a couple of guys at the end. Who's he going to keep? Who's he going to cut? And we go through, we get to 20, this was when they had 25-man roster. We get to 24, and I said, okay, who's your 25th man? And he said, Gerald Perry, who he had coached in Atlanta too, and now he's in St. Louis. And I said, Gerald Perry? He said, yeah, he's my wild card. Okay, now, season starts, first week of the season, that's when ABC had Monday Night Baseball. The Cardinals are involved in a Monday Night Baseball game. We had a young center fielder named Ray Langford, who's a brilliant player, great speed, good power, first year up. We're in St. Louis. Home dugout is on the first base side. Ray Langford's up, runner on second, runner on third, 2 outs, and he pops up in the infield. And he gets about a third of the way down the first base line, and he peels off and starts to come back to the dugout. Before the ball's even caught. The ball was eventually caught, and the inning was over. He gets halfway between the baseline and the dugout. Here comes Gerald Perry out of the dugout, sticks his finger in his chest, like boom, says, don't you ever do that again. Don't you ever embarrass us. You run every ball out or I'm going to kick you all the way back to Modesto, California where you belong. And all of a sudden everybody on the bench is going, whoa, that's a leader. That's what Joe Torre, and I after the game was over, I said, T, I know what you mean by wild card now. But there aren't many guys like that today. Don mentioned that they all have their online personas, they all have their own storylines. Nobody's going to get in front of somebody and take their persona away from them. Nobody's going to be the bad guy. Very few today. So the answer with Dusty and I said, we're lucky if there's 5 people in baseball who are leaders anymore, who will get in front of somebody and say, and I'm sure you guys see it in your work too. There aren't many people who will, look, somebody's kind of taking it easy. Nobody's going to say, no, we don't do that here. That's not the way we run this company. And that's not the way they should run baseball either.
Well, you saw about a week or two ago, Aaron Judge, who rarely says anything controversial, came out on the DL, or IL, and he called out the Yankees for losing their focus. It was, for him, rather outspoken. And you know what? Those comments went. They started playing much, much better baseball. So, because he, again, understood the power of his words. For him to say that publicly, people are going to take notice and say, well, if we made him mad, we've got problems.
We, at USA Baseball, I'm on the board of directors, we run the WBC, and we had a great group of guys this year. The team was put together the right way, guys who cared about each other, guys who were into it and involved in helping each other. And I hadn't been around. I was with Derek Jeter, and had saw how he led. And I was with him when he first signed, came into Major League Baseball. But I hadn't seen him in the last couple of years because I don't cover the Yankees. And I hadn't seen his persona in the clubhouse. And just as you're saying, he's grown up. He's got a gravitas now. And the way he led the players on that WBC team, everybody looked up to him. You can look up to somebody as they play the game, but then, is he invested in me? Does he care about me as a teammate? Is he looking out for me, or is it just about him? And that's the kind of player he is. He's become that. He's become even, I think in the end, he could be a better leader than Derek Jeter was. That's saying something, but he's that kind of a guy. So it was great to see that and observe that.
Yeah, society is different, and leadership has to look different than it did in Jerry Clary's.
To me, hang on one sec. To me, life is about relationships, right? No matter, it always comes down to that. So, and we've all been around. So remember, George did the Yankees for 2 years, right? With Seaver and Rizzuto. So give me, it's almost like a Barra story, but give me something about, because I thought that you and Seaver got the most out of Scooter because he wasn't talking about birthdays as much or Cracker Jacks. You really made him talking about, and he had a lot to say, but you had to lead him to it. I got so many Scooter stories I could tell that are tremendous, but I'll tell you this one story that is genuine, and it's Scooter. We go to Milwaukee, and Scooter played a lot of golf. Every time we go to Milwaukee, Scooter would play golf, with different friends. And if you remember Joe DiMaggio's streak, when it was stopped in Cleveland, he had Keltner?
Kenny Keltner was the guy who stopped his streak. And every time we went to Milwaukee, they'd be playing. And we go we're playing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday series. And we go to the old stadium, and Scooter comes to the ballpark, and he says, I said, Scooter, did you play golf today? He said, no, we couldn't play golf because it was ladies' day at the golf course. They wouldn't let us on the golf course, so I couldn't see Keltner. But he's going to come up to he would always come up, just like we go to Boston, Johnny Pesky would come up and they'd talk for a couple of innings. So we start the game, and Scooter, Seaver asked him, he says, so Scooter, did you play golf today? And he said, no, it was ladies' day. Yeah, the ladies, why are they doing it at the golf course? They should be back in the kitchen. So now, we go like this. Nothing really happens, but I get up and we split it. We do 3 innings on, 3 innings off, and so on and so forth. So I get out and I go in Tom Skybosh was the PR director in Milwaukee. I said, Sky, Scooter just said, the women belong back in the kitchen. So wait an inning or so and come in and say, Scooter, did you say something about, women or something? Because we're getting some phone calls. So now, Bud Selig runs, this is before Bud Selig became commissioner. He owned the Brewers. So when I went to Bud and I said, Bud, wait till about the 6th inning and come in and say, Scooter, what did you do? They're picketing outside. So Skybosh comes in and Scooter goes, yeah, don't worry about it. Now Bud comes in and he's got a serious look on his face. Scooter takes his glasses and says, we got people picketing outside the stadium. What did you say about women? And he goes, no, really? Should I go on the air and say something? And he looks at Bud and Bud starts to smile. But we got Scooter. He was, he was the greatest guy in the world. And he was like doing a game with your old Italian uncle. It was precious. And there's so many stories like that and it's true. They're all true. They were all true.
Were you in the booth when Pete Gray came in the booth?
No.
Tell the story for another day.
Well, and one thing that really has always impressed me about Dom is not just his ability to write, but his ability to report. And when you have someone that can report like that and write as Dom does, and that's why he gets, there's so many, Dom would come on my Sunday night show many times. Never got paid to do it, but would come on, and we had a lot of fun. But I always had great respect for the fact that not only was he a tremendous writer, but a great reporter. And not every writer is a great reporter. Would you agree with that?
Well, very few writers check all the boxes, can do all of the different things you can do. Adrian Wojnarowski checks all the boxes. Buster Olney checks all the boxes. And frankly, probably the one thing I would wish I were better at is reporting, because I've never been the most aggressive guy. Buck Showalter used to say, if you wait for the perfect time to do something, you'll never do it. And I would tend to be slow to pull the trigger on something. Probably, should have. But, covering the Yankees, I had covered the Giants earlier and then the Yankees. I was around the best of the best beat guys, beat reporters. And George King from the New York Post was the best by far that I've ever worked with. And the kind of things he would do is he would come in, locker room would open, clubhouse would open. He'd walk in and, us idiots are all talking to each other, shooting the bull. But George would look in every locker, and if he saw a locker didn't have civilian clothes hanging up, he knew, okay, he's not here. Then he'd go ask the clubhouse guy, where's, so-and-so? And next thing you know, he's got it, hey, he's going to get an MRI on his elbow or something, and we're all sitting there chasing him. So, people think reporting, you have to be this hard-nosed, digger and all of that. Really, your 2 eyes and your 2 ears are your best tools for a reporter. If you make use of those, you can really be ahead of the crowd if you use those effectively.
He's too modest, but the bottom line is in our profession, you walk into a clubhouse and there are reporters who are well respected by players, managers, coaches, who know that when they talk to a person and something is off the record, it stays off the record. When they talk to a person, there's no story behind the story. In other words, they're not trying to get something and then use it later on. And whatever we do in life, if you're a school teacher, if you're a librarian, if you're a broadcaster, or if you're working in town hall now, as this guy is, making the transition, all we can do is be the best that we can be. And, Mom and Dad always told me, say, you don't have to be the smartest guy in the world, but be the fairest guy in the world and be the hardest working guy in the world, and you'll do okay. And I think that's something that, you know, we don't talk enough about that. Everybody wants to be the star. Everybody wants to be the shining light. But what makes things work are the people that do their job every day and do it with a feeling that I'm a professional and I want to hold myself to a higher standard than maybe the guy that's next to me. And in the end, you win. And this guy has done that throughout his career. Not only is he a great writer, not only is he a great reporter, but he has the utmost respect of those people that he's covered throughout his career. And that, hey, when it's all said and done, I mean, I'll go home with that as a tag on my shoulder more than anything else, and I think that's what Dom certainly can do.
Well, thank you, George. I think we would all agree that the greatest compliment you could get, the only compliment I ever really want to hear is, he's a professional. He handles himself like a professional.
And he's fair.
Not enough of that.
You know, I mean, we all have to report bad things once in a while too. You know, you just can't report, you know, when, you know, Paul O'Neill has a good game, you got to report the bad games too. But if you're fair, then guys, you know, some guys, you know, might only want good reporting and they'll hold it against you. But the bottom line is those people that understand what the world is about, all you need to do is be fair. And I think that's something that we all strive to do.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that I always felt is, if you're covering someone, first off, know your stuff, and secondly, be fair. And if you approach them that way, you know, there was, Paul Coffey came to the Whalers late in his career, Hall of Famer, and you talk about a guy who was mailing it in. And finally, one night I said, listen, he's a future Hall of Famer, and Vic can attest to that, how he played. I said, but the effort he's putting forth is not fair to his teammates. It's not fair to the fans who pay good money, you know, to come and see him. He's acting like a Hall of Famer. Next game, I'm in the press box, and one of the Whalers scouts came up to me. He said, I heard what you said about Coffey the other night. Now, I didn't know which way this was going. I said, yeah. And he said, you're absolutely right. And he walked away. Questions? Anybody want to come up? I can come to you or put the thing here. And any questions for any of us?
I got one for George. George, you gotta have a good Whitey Herzog story. I gotta hear one.
Again, you got a ton of them. Well, I tell you, okay, here's a Whitey Herzog, Doug Harvey story. Doug Harvey's umpiring a Cardinal game, and he kicks Whitey out of the ball game in St. Louis. So Whitey's back in the clubhouse, and he's fuming after he's been kicked out of the game by Doug. And he ends up taking somebody had given him a big cowboy hat, and he took the cowboy hat and wrote profanity on the cowboy hat and told the clubhouse guy to bring it over to the umpires. This is while the game is still going on. Bring it over to the umpire's room and put it on Doug Harvey's chair when he got in there. And the next day, Doug Harvey, they came out to exchange lineup cards, and Doug Harvey says, I got your message. and this is for those of you that are Mets fans, this is another true story. Whitey was in the minor leagues with the Mets organization before he became a manager. And in 1986, the Mets win. Before that, in 84, Whitey's in St. Louis. He left Kansas City, went to St. Louis, and there's rumors that things are shaky for Davey Johnson with the Mets after they had won, and the feeling was that Davey might be fired. And so I go into St. Louis, and I said, Whites, They said, would you take the Mets job? He always wanted to come back and manage the Mets. Would you take the Mets job? And he said, let me tell you something. This game just ended. I got one newspaper reporter, Rick Hummel, came in, asked me a couple of questions. I got one TV reporter that came in, asked me a couple of questions. Now, they left. I'm going out the back door. I'm going home, and I'm going to be fishing at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. He says, if I was in New York, you know what would have happened? The first round of reporters would have come through, asked me all the questions. There's 10 newspaper reporters, there's 10 radio reporters and TV reporters. They go out, then they go to the players and tell them what I said about them. And then they come back to me and want to know what I have to say about what the players said about me. So now I'm still sitting in my office. And then tomorrow morning, I wake up in New York and the back page of the Daily News says, Herzog says this or whatever. He said, so do I want that aggravation? No, thank you. I'm not going back to New York. So he was smart enough to understand that. But I learned so much from Billy Martin. I was very close with Bobby Cox. Of course, he was here in West Haven. And I'll tell you one quick story, but Whitey Herzog was, if I make a list of the 5 best managers, smartest managers, he's on that list. You can pick who's your best. But this is a Bobby Cox story that's a true story. I'm doing the West Haven Yankee games on radio. Bobby Cox is the manager at Quigley Stadium. And at Quigley Stadium, the manager's office is like the size of the bathroom over here. And right next to you is the washing machine and the dryer. So you're trying to do an interview and the washing machine dryer is going on. And at the time I'm doing radio and I was doing Channel 8, the weekend sports. So Coxie says, what are you doing after the game time? I said, I got to do the 11 o'clock sports. He said, well, would you come back? I said, what do you mean would I come back? Yeah, what do you need? He said, come down to Quigley Stadium, go down the left field line, meet me after you're finished at 11:30, point your car towards the mound and leave it running with the lights on. Now, what had been happening was the mound at Quigley Stadium was horrendous. Maybe some of you might remember the name Eddie Irons. Eddie was the hired by the town to take care of the field. But he didn't know the first thing about a baseball field. He was a wonderful guy, a big guy, burly guy. So all the pitchers were complaining about the mound at Quigley. So we go around, 12 o'clock at night, we spent 2.5 hours. Bobby Cox rebuilt the mound in the dark. We dug the mound out and he tamped it. He was he was in the minor leagues as a manager, a coach, and whatever, as a player too. He rebuilt the mound. We leave. Next day, batting practice comes, and I'm walking out, and the players are walking past the mound and looking at, whoa! And they look at Eddie Irons and say, Eddie, great job on the mound. And Eddie goes, no problem. Bobby Cox never told anybody that he rebuilt the mound. Eddie Irons got all the credit.
Wow.
That was Bobby Cox.
That's awesome. You had a question earlier, right?
Yeah, I just was wondering, by the way, it's quite obvious that you two really loved what you did and you're very, very good at it now. Just wondering how you feel about reporters and newscasters and sports writers today.
Well, of course, I'm still one of them, so. Well, a lot of, on the writing side, writers have lost the ability to be proactive and try to get their own story. Particularly the young writers who went to college during the pandemic, because all they know are press conferences and Zoom calls and group interviews. They don't realize that that's only part of it. And so they've lost that element of trying to go and get their own story and do it in their own way. It's much harder to do today because the teams, college, pro, any sport, any level, they make it harder to do And that means you have to work even that much harder, to do it. So I'm always pushing our young reporters to be proactive. The text you. Worst thing you can do is ignore you. Text Stan Hurley. Worst thing you can do is ignore you. I texted him not too long ago, and next morning he called me back. I mean, he'll do it, but they're intimidated, by that. So they tend to kind of settle for easy, routine stories, and that's why you see the same stories every day, everywhere, because they're not out really trying to develop their own story. I mean, for me, and I'm not saying I'm going to win a Pulitzer Prize or any of these things I've done recently, but at least I change it up and I try to get stories that are not the same thing everyone else is doing. So I think reporters have lost that facet of sports writing, and it's made sports writing weaker, on the writing side. On the broadcasting side, I'll have to defer to these guys to talk about that.
Part of a Whitey Herzog story too. Once when I first started, I asked a question. I said, this was when I called him Mr. Herzog, and he said, don't call me Mr. Herzog. But later on, we became great friends. I said, Mr. Herzog, this may be a dumb question. He said, hold on. He said, do you love the game of baseball? Do you care about the game of baseball? There are no dumb questions if you care about the game of baseball. But from a broadcast standpoint, I think today, the young broadcasters are better prepared. So many of them get to broadcast through in college and minor leagues and get the opportunity to hone their craft a lot better than we did when we first started. And Steve Lennox might comment on this a little bit too. He does the Quinnipiac games now. He's done baseball. He's done the Olympics. He's done a bunch of things. But I think the one thing that I see that we didn't have to worry about was, like in minor league baseball, when I did the West Ham Yankees, there were no notes. You got, like Dick Young said, you go in, you get your own stories. And whatever you got, you got. I can watch a game or listen to a game on the radio or TV now, and I know if a guy's done his homework because they got all the notes. And believe me, now that you get 6, 7, 8, 9 pages of notes, so you can sit there and make it seem like you know what's going on, that he's, 2 for his last 22, or he's this or that, the statistics, the analytics that you have. But our game, the game of baseball, is about stories. And our job is about telling stories. That means, how about where this guy came from? How about his minor league career? How about what he's working on because he's 2 for 22? What's he dealing with? What's the human element that you're dealing with? Not the statistical element, not the analytical element that everybody is pushed to do. If I was doing games today, I'd probably be fired because, number one, I'd never read a gambling ad. And we got gambling ads every time you turn around. You're in a situation where there's so much that's being sold. Pete Rose got banned from the game of baseball for gambling. He really got banned because he money laundered more than anything else. But now they're in bed with gambling, which to me is so far from what it should be. So I think it's changed. All of our professions have changed. All of our businesses have changed, and baseball has too. Steve, when you think back of where our profession is right now?
I'm trying to pass along at Quinnipiac, talking to media students about a lot of what you guys have shared, what I've learned from you guys, what Rich I think does as well. I have a routine, Billy Mecca. Just wrapped up 9th year at Quinnipiac. So years ago, Billy and I started working together on the ESPN3 side. I said, Billy, the media students down here, they should want my job. They never talk to me. I have a routine. My routine's changed now because now it's a couple of trips to the bathroom before the game just to make sure. Sorry. So years ago now, I went to them and I said, look, I said, you guys at least know who I am. You can Google me if you want, but you know, I've had a decent career. You guys should want my job, if that's what you want to do. I said, when I come back through here, I want somebody to tell me a joke. I still talk to that first person who did it. So now, years later, the student broadcast is at the end. I said, what do you have? You know, give me something. I'm going to give you something. You're going to give me something. I'm not going to use yours, but you can use mine. And they started understanding that, where they would find a story. So this year, Sacred Heart's in. I said, hey, you know the big man here? I said, he just became a dad today. He's a proud papa. His cat, who we didn't know was pregnant, had a litter of kittens earlier in the day. And again, it's showing up early, as you guys have done throughout your careers. Be the first one in the gym, at the ballpark. I've always taken pride in that and always have thought about, you know, who am I going to beat? Warner Fusell is a guy from when I was in the minor leagues in Brooklyn. He was in Brooklyn. And Warner, I got to know a scout with the Rays that year. He goes, you're never going to make it. He goes, you don't have that work ethic. It's pouring. The booth in Brooklyn is out in the elements. And Warner Fusell and Warner was, would you call him the backup to Mel Allen on This Week in Baseball? Yeah. His voice was on there as well. And it was getting to be in the booth with him and just sitting and listening. But the guy said, you know, Warner was still doing a pregame show during the rain delay. My equipment, if I spit on it, it was going to short out, and it wasn't going to work that night. So everything was bundled up, and we weren't on the air until the game went. But the kids now, they do have a lot. You know, Quinnipiac is a great school for it. In many ways, they're taught the right way. But in having the conversations with them, it is trying to get them to, okay, you took the story this far. How do you take it a little bit further? So the kid asked me, do you know the mother's name of the cats? And so I said, yeah, good follow-up. The mother's name, and there's 3 or 4, and they had already named 2. The guy had a huge game after the game, we're interviewing them. And that was one of my great things. And they were listening, they sort of like knew that we were talking with Anquan at the end of the game, like, you had a busy day, and this is a great way to cap it off with a road victory. But it was showing up early, and getting that across to them, and understanding that. I claimed, and I maybe it continued throughout the season, they're just not going to beat me to the gym. But like you said, to reach out to Tom McCord, figure out how to visit with him one-on-one, because as you know, Dom knows he's accessible, and he'll give you the time, and he'll teach you a lot as well. Sorry, so long-winded. May I ask a quick question? Your thoughts on, there are a lot of former big leaguers, former minor league players that are never going to give the opportunity, present day, or at least for the next 5 to 10 years likely, of managing or coaching in the minors. What do you make of the makeup of not only minor league staffs this year, because we don't know any of the names. I mean, I'm far removed now from minor league baseball, but I don't know any of these names. They're not former players. Their bios are just, they're not, they didn't play pro ball. And even on the major league level, you're seeing guys who have no pro experience. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well,
and thank you.
Well, baseball's always looking for new approaches to jobs. And we saw it here in Connecticut, the New Britain High School baseball coach went right from there to managing in the minor leagues for the Orioles. Now he's managing in Double-A, which is very obviously, probably unprecedented. And now you saw this year, the Giants took a wild shot, brought in the Tennessee coach to be the manager, and from everything I've seen and heard, he seems to be a train wreck in that job. But the traditional roots to those jobs have changed, and the usual thing, kind of a journeyman major leaguer becomes the minor league manager and starts to move up the ladder. And then the major leagues looks to a minor league manager to be their next major league manager. Those roots are now kind of different. Everybody's looking for some different approach to managing. And they're usually cyclical. So I would guess that 10 years from now, you might see everything back to the way it used to be, because it works like that in baseball.
Before Vic is going to have a question, thinking about relationships, I talked before about it, I think sometimes when you have, say, an athlete or a coach, speaking with them about something other than the sport that they coach. And I found that to be true with, I thought, to me, Jim Calhoun was the most, what's the word? There's a lot of them, but he was everywhere, right? In his thoughts and everything else, most complicated person. But you know what? I did his coaches show for 2 years, and we'd sit sometimes before we started rolling tape and just talk about everyday things. And I had just read his book, first one that he did, and Dom did a book with Coach Calhoun as well. Where is it available on?
Anywhere fine books are sold.
Thank you. And you know, I read in the book that he was 16 years old. He's playing in a baseball game, and someone yelled to him, Jim Calhoun, you got to go home, your dad just died. And that's how he found out. So, not that I found out that way, but as my brother can attest to, you know, when you experience something like that at a young age, and we would talk, it was so much different than our conversations about sports, and I think that's where a lot of the trust and stuff came from. So fast forward to, in 2019, my 30-year anniversary at Fox, someone had the idea to go out and speak with Calhoun and just tape something with him that we would roll in during the end of the break, before we went to the commercial. And I knew none of this. I'm sitting at my desk and I look up and I see Calhoun talking and my name about 30-year anniversary. He goes through this thing and he says, now sometimes you can be a schmuck. and George and I had a long connection with the Franciscan nuns in Merritt, who are phenomenal. And George and I were just and Don was at the dinner as well, and I brought it up there, but and every time it shows up in my Facebook memories, I say, who else can have a Hall of Famer call him a schmuck on the air? And it's sort of kind of a badge of honor, I guess, in some ways, but he is unique.
Thanks, Rich. I have a question about today's game. I want some of your thoughts, but I just want to mention a quick thing about Rizzuto. It's great to hear those stories about Rizzuto. My mom was a big baseball fan. She used to take me to Yankee Stadium, and when I was about 10 maybe, she pointed out Phil Rizzuto walking by. I didn't know who he was. She encouraged me to go get an autograph, and I did. Well, fast forward to Phil's last year in the booth, because of my connection with the Whalers, which is how I know Rich, I was able to get in the broadcast booth up in Fenway just to watch the game. And I got to meet Phil. And he asked me to do his scorecard, which I was thrilled to do, which was great. And of course, he's kibitzing the whole game. He was amazing. I was just thrilled that he was exactly like he was on the air. It was not a phony. And in fact, when it was his turn to go on, like you said, he used to rotate the innings. I had to go find him in the broadcast because he was BSing with the guards. And I'm like, Scooter, you got it? He goes, yeah, I'll be there. He came in, you know. It was just terrific. He asked me to come back the next night to do his card again, which, like an idiot, I didn't, but I had young kids and what. But he also asked me to say hi to Gordie Howe for him. So I was wearing my Whalers alumni shirt, and I said, yeah, I'll be seeing him next month. I got to say hi to Gordie for Phil, and it was like, wow, that was a thrill for me as a hack, you know, sports fan my whole life, and that was pretty exciting. But my question, all these new features, the Ghost Runner, the challenges, the ABS, I happen to like them all, even though I've been, a baseball fan for almost 7 years. Anyway, I do like them all. There's a couple tweaks I'd like to see, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. I know a lot of old school people don't like these kind of things, especially the Ghost Runner. I'd almost like to see the 10 played legit, then the Ghost Runner. Rather than that, I like it because it's an element, it adds to the game. You don't have an 18-inning game that just inning after it,
Well, the Ghost Runner I don't really like. I just think it's kind of forced and artificial. But the rest of them, I think, are working. The ABS, I think, was a success. And, the pitch clock, I think, is a success. And I think replay, for the most part, is a success. You tweak the rules around a little bit. So basically, I like most of the changes. The games are much crisper. They move a lot faster. But I don't like the Ghost Runner. that one I'll disagree with you.
Two things, I'm very close with the umpires we talked about. Rich Marazzi and I spent a lot of time in umpires' rooms, and I believed in that. Every time I went to the ballpark, I went in the umpires' room, talked to the umpires to get their view. And the interesting part of it is you build a relationship that lasts after they're gone. In fact, the last of the guys I was with just took a buyout this week, and they're all new young umpires. But the interesting thing, Terry Tate is retired now in Cheshire, and when they announced the ABS was going to be installed this year, I called him up. I said, T, what do you think? And he goes, another nail in the coffin. And one quick story about the scorecard. David Kalmowitz was our booth guy at WPIX. He did Scooter never did a scorecard. He always had somebody do his scorecard. And David he was perfect. He did it for him and got it all set. Scooter would do it. Now, we rotated, but usually Scooter would do the first 3 innings, then he'd get 3 innings off and come back. Then the next game, he'd get the first 3 innings off, and we'd rotate that way. But Scooter, in the middle of the game, would get 3 innings off. So we ended up, he would come back, I'd get my 3 innings off, and I'd come back, and I was talking to somebody, and I didn't have 2 at-bats on my scorecard that I'm still carrying around with me as I'm going around the press box. And I said, Scooter, what happened with Fisk? He was catching for the Chicago White Sox. And I said, what happened with Fisk in the 6th inning? And he shows me his scorecard. And, he's got 4-3, second to first. He's got F8, fly ball to center field. And then he's got WW. And I said, and what's WW? He says, wasn't watching. And I still have his scorecard with WW on it, wasn't watching. He really did write that. I mean,
I knew you were going to bring up the
Well, legend has it that there was also a HCFS, which was for Here Comes Bleepin' Stump. I don't know if that's true or not, but that story went around. Hey, we're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but I think with respect to where the game is now, I would just like to hear you guys' thoughts. I mean, analytics play such a huge role in the game today, and there's one thing that I think was attributed to Joe Torre. Supposedly he said to Cashman at one time, something to the effect of the game has a pulse or the game has a heartbeat. And when you think about that, all these numbers, but the game is still played by human beings. So obviously there's a place for it, but I mean, it can get out of hand. George, you first. Do you like analytics, or do you think it's too much?
I'll tell you 2 stories. The 2 of the managers that were on that top 5 list were Earl Weaver and Whitey Herzog. And I went into Earl Weaver's office once, and I was sitting in the old Memorial Stadium, and he had a guy named Randy Milligan, who was a bench player, played sometimes, but was a bench player. And every time I'd watch, and there'd be back then you had, sacrifice bunts were something that everybody used all the time. He never had Randy Milligan when he would pinch hit for him with him, or he would be in the lineup with a runner on first base. He never had him sacrifice bunt. And I said, Earl, I'm looking, you have a lot of guys sacrifice. You never have Randy Milligan sacrifice. He said, you want to know why? He opens up, he had it's like a school desk. And he's got 3x5 cards with little writings on it. And what he had was Randy Milligan's at-bats in pressure situations with runners on second or runners on first or whatever. Every time he had a sacrifice situation with Randy Milligan, he put on the hit and run. And 75% of the time, Randy Milligan ended up with a base hit. So bottom line was he had analytics back then. And Whitey Herzog did the same thing. Nobody ever knew Whitey Herzog had 3x5 cards in the top drawer of his desk. He did. I believe analytics should be used like salt and pepper, not like meat and potatoes. But what we do today is we use analytics like meat and potatoes. They are the game. You talk about people criticize Aaron Boone for his moves. They criticize this guy for their moves. Managers today aren't managers. They're middle managers. They are put in a place where they listen to the general manager and the analytics department tell them before a game. And this is a true story. When Tito Francona was manager of the Red Sox, I'd go in early. We were friends from when he was at Arizona, and he won the Golden Spikes. I emceed 1980 when he won the Golden Spikes Award. Jerry Kindle was his coach. We became friends then, and we're still friends today. I'd go in like 12:30, 1 o'clock. He'd be sitting at his desk. We'd be sitting talking. Ben Charrington was an assistant GM with the Red Sox at that time. He comes in at 1 o'clock, puts the projected analytic lineup on Tito's desk in front of him. And Tito says, "Thanks, Ben," so on and so forth. And he schmoozed him with it, but then he put his own lineup together. That's because he had gravitas when he was with the Red Sox. Flash forward, Bobby Valentine takes over as manager of the Red Sox. I'm in the same place, and one of the minions from the analytics department comes in, puts the analytic lineup down in front of Bobby V at 1 o'clock, and the kid hasn't even left the room yet. He goes like that, meaning you can take that lineup and shove it. So you knew Bobby wasn't going to last very long as he did that. But 85% of the managers today are middle managers. They are told this guy can only throw 60 pitches, 50 pitches. This guy cannot be used more than so many days, so many pitches, so on. A guy could be in a hit streak, but the analytics department says you got to get more time off. So he's got a 6-game hit streak, and they'll sit him. Why is he sitting? Because the analytics department tells him to do that. So I understand analytics. There were analytics in the old days. They're much more prevalent today. But I'd like to see them as salt and pepper, not as meat and potatoes.
Yeah, the analytics are only as good as the people using them, the people interpreting them. And they're always interpreted, differently. I think, where it got out of hand, and back in 2002 when the A's lost Giambi, who was the MVP the year before, and if you've ever seen the movie Moneyball,
Billy Bean.
yeah, and Billy Bean says, "Well, we're going to replace him in the aggregate." I'm thinking, well, I hate this already. We're going to replace him in the aggregate, and we're going to get Scott Hatterberg, and all the old scouts say, "Oh, he's got a bad arm, he's injured, he's a 260 hitter." Nope, he gets on base. Then Jeremy Giambi, but he can't run, he can't do anything, he's unathletic, but he gets on base. Then the third guy was David Justice, and he's washed up. I mean, his bat's going to be dead by July, whatever. Yeah, but he gets on base. And of course, this was presented as if Billy Bean knew the answers, and these scouts were old, out of touch, well, go back and look at it. The A's did win the division that year because they had Hudson, Mulder, and Zito at the top of the rotation. Those guys, the scouts were absolutely right about all three of those guys. They didn't do anything special. But the point is, the idea of the analytics was to identify undervalued players for complementary roles, right? We need a backup catcher. We're looking at 3 different guys. Well, this guy frames the ball better. This guy takes more pitches. We need a second baseman. Well, this guy can do this, and et cetera. That's what it's for. It was never meant to decide whether to give somebody a 10-year contract or not. It was never meant to decide how people get into the Hall of Fame. It was never meant to decide who's the MVP is. And that's why you have guys who are, 11 and 12. The Cy Young Award has become the hard luck pitcher of the year. So again, I think analytics have a lot of value. They're very interesting. if you cover baseball, you have got to know analytics because that's what the management is using to make these decisions. You've got to be able to explain that to your readers. But I think George is absolutely right. It's one tool in the toolbox, and it's not the only tool in the toolbox.
Yeah, Don mentions, the Maddox, the Mulder and Zito, and if you watch Moneyball, they never mention them during the whole movie. And the bottom line, if you're a baseball person, you say, "What do you mean? They got the 3 best pitchers in the friggin' league. That's why they won."
Well, the other one, the guy who's supposed to be, I guess, Pete Podesta, whatever, but he's got a fictional name, and he just, worships Billy Beane because he had the guts to let Johnny Damon go. And he said, this is the problem. They don't chase players, they chase stars instead of players chasing wins. Damon's not worth whatever, $7 million a year, whatever. Johnny Damon, who made winning plays everywhere he went. He won a championship with the Red Sox, played a big part in it. Won a championship with the Yankees, played a big part in it. By the way, still waiting on Oakland to get out of any playoff series since 2002. So, some players are just winning players. So I think recently there's a little bit of a flap because Jorge Posada was kind of ripping analytics. And the analytics people were saying how, through all this period of time that they played, he was the worst catcher in the league at runs saved. And Jeter was the worst shortstop in the league at runs saved. And I'm thinking, how do the Yankees win 95 games every year if their shortstop was the worst, not average, the worst, and their catcher was the worst? When that team, those 90s Yankees teams, they're very undervalued in the Hall of Fame because these analytics people say, well, Jeter's not that good, he only had the opportunities because he was with the Yankees. And Pettit's not that good, he only had the postseason opportunities because he was with the Yankees. And Rivera, not that valuable, he only had all those save opportunities because he was with the Yankees. And I'm thinking, well, and Joe Torre's not a good manager, he just had all that talent with the Yankees. Well, what's using? Somebody must have been good for them to win all those championships. So, there's the word, if there were an analytics, if analytics were a city, my picture would be in the post office. But I just think that the way it's used in a way that's far beyond and removed from what it was intended to be. It was intended as a useful tool. And now it's become, if you don't think war is the only stat that matters, you're an idiot. and I just, every year I get my Hall of Fame ballot, and now I'm hearing how, you got to put, Bobby Brave in the Hall of Fame. I'm just not there, The second baseman had a better chance of running into the right field while the catcher ball.
And what people have always said for years, championship teams are strong up the middle, and you're taking the shortstop and catcher and saying they're that bad?
The
That's...
center field have been through.
Right. And with that, I want to thank George, thank you, Don. Please let them hear it. Thank you guys. Thanks for the good, great questions. Thanks for coming out. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.